Hello, and welcome to the Doof Book Club, our monthly live stream discussion of a book chosen by you, our listeners. My name is Matt Freeman, and I am your host, and I'm joined, as always, by some idiot looking for Cloud Cuckoo Land.
It's real, Matt. It's real, and I'm gonna find it. You'll see. I just got to turn into a donkey, and then a fish. Was it a fish? And then a
You're Scott.
bird, and then I'll realize that the cloud cuckoo land we made was the friends. All right, this this metaphor really didn't really didn't work. But hello everyone, and welcome. I hope you are all having a wonderful Friday evening. I see a whole bunch of familiar names in the chat. Hello to everyone. If you are new here, if this is the first book club of ours you've ever done, welcome. We are Doof Media. That's Matt. I'm Scott, and we make podcasts all about the stories we love. We also arrange and organize this here monthly book club, which Matt will now explain. And as Matt is saying in the chat, thank you, Matt. We've had some previous instances of unbalanced audio. We're trying to get better at that. So if it's a little unbalanced, let us know in which way, and we can adjust it as we go. Matt, what's a book club?
Well, each month, Scott and I select 5 books from a pool submitted to us by our wonderful Doof community. We put up a poll for all the supporters over on Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia and let them vote on which they'd like us to talk about. The book with the most votes wins, and then we all read it.
And then we meet here on the last/first Friday of the month and spend an hour or so chatting all about the book. Before we get into this month's book, though, we have a little bit of homework to do because one of the things we do for our book club is let our patrons vote on it. But we have a special treat for those of you that attend live. We also give you the chance to vote, twice basically, if you're a patron, or once at all if you're not a patron. So I'm about to drop a link here in the chat, and this link will be open for the rest of the show. There are 5 books on this list. You get to vote for 2 of them, and we will add the results of this to the results of our patron poll, which right now it shows a tie between 2 of our books. So either way, you guys are going to influence the result of this poll and help us decide what we're going to be doing next month. So get voting on that. All right, enough of that stuff. Let's get into it. Matt, tell me about this month's book. This was actually not a book chosen by our listeners, right? This was a book chosen by you. We do every 6 months, we allow ourselves to pick one of the books ourselves, and you picked this book. So tell us about Cloud Cuckoo Land. Matt, go.
That is correct. Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. The summary is as follows. How do we weather the end of things? Cloud Cuckoo Land brings together an unforgettable cast of dreamers and outsiders from past, present, and future to offer a vision of survival against all odds. And the summary goes on to kind of dig into each of the characters, which I think is not a bad approach to going about this particular book because it doesn't really summarize too cleanly. That's not too bad of a kind of spoiler-free overall introduction to what this book is, really.
I looked around the internet to see if there was a more concise, shorter version of the summary than what we have laid out here on our script, and there really wasn't. And I think it's for that exact reason you're talking about here. It's difficult to distill the plot of this book down to just a few lines. Speaking of that, Matt, what did you think of Cloud Cuckoo Land? Obviously, this is the first time you had read this book. This is the first time I had read this book as well. Tell me what you thought about it. And while you were doing that, those folks listening at home, please also tell us, what did you think of this novel?
Probably still processing it to a degree, but I found it to be charming, delightful, and surprisingly poignant in a number of ways. Um, I was always caught off guard by how I would like something would really hit me, and I would maybe even tear up a little bit, and I would be like, "Why did that hit me?" Like because it was never sort of obvious like schmaltz or the sort of manipulativeness that you can get with a lot of narratives, with most narratives you could even say. It was always just the poignancy really just kind of rose from like the dignity and humanity of characters doing their best in a bad situation, not even because they were like being heroes, they were just soldiering on. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, it really, especially toward like the back half, um it really worked for me in that way. overall really, really enjoyed it. I will say I couldn't figure out where we were going for like the first quarter of the book. I was like, what are we doing here? Like, are these threads all going to come together? Is there going to be some through line? And then ultimately, you figure it out. You're like, okay, there is a through line, but it's more of it's almost like a philosophical through line
Yeah.
more than anything. I mean, there's the through line of like the story, right? But the Cloud Cuckoo Land book, I should say. Um, but that's almost just like a coat hanger for like the theme to hang on.
Yeah. No, I think you're definitely right there. Man, I really loved this book. I had no idea what to expect from this thing. I had heard good things. Obviously, Anthony Doerr is the writer of All the Light We Cannot See, which I believe won the Pulitzer Prize. So I was aware of him. My wife read that book and was very fond of it, and so I it's not that I had high expectations coming in. I was just like, oh, this guy is supposed to be really good, and yeah, I mean, I was kind of blown away by how really just flat out enjoyable this book was to read, and it makes such a contrast to the Cormac McCarthy book we did last month, right? I mean, not saying I'm not making a judgment pass on which book is quote unquote better or not, but it was just like a completely different reading experience from that book, and really refreshing actually coming out of that book. And I think you're absolutely right that it is a book that takes a long time to kind of figure out what it's doing, and I think that's kind of a testament to the author's confidence in his character building and his writing, in that he's like, it's going to take you a bit to get what I'm doing here, but I trust that you're going to be along for the ride even as you're going, okay, huh, sure. And I think that's the thing that worked so well for me on this thing, is that up until the point where I was like, oh, I get it. I was just like, I am in love with all these disparate stories. I am in love with every one of these stories, and it was never a moment of, damn it, I'm leaving this story to join this other story. It was like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to put that aside, and now I'm anxious to find out what's happening in this next one. That was what carried me through all of the, and then as the thematic stuff starts to pile in, and you realize what the story is doing and what it's saying, and of course we all know I am a sucker for stories about stories, and this is a book that is basically talking about the power of storytelling, the power of story in general, the timeless eternal nature of it in a lot of ways, and that's just like right up my alley. So yeah, I loved everything about this thing.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. I totally agree with you on in terms of keeping the stories balanced and weaving together at just like the perfect pace. It really is a kind of um, a study in how to do that right.
Mm-hmm.
And I was briefly listening to a couple of interviews with Anthony Doerr, and apparently that was a thing that he really prioritized was, in his own words, kind of. I think there's like roughly five main characters, and he was basically saying, yeah, I'd like the importance of keeping these five plates spinning in a way where the interest is never really flagging. You're always interested to see like, oh yeah, how is Zeno doing? Oh yeah, oh yeah, what is going to happen with Seymour? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
the Constance. Yeah, what a fantastic mystery. What's going on over here?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just like you said, it's maybe like the only time in my life that I haven't been like at least slightly like, this character,
Yeah. Right. Right. And
Um,
even when you're like leaving a character on maybe not even a cliffhanger, but just a plot beat that you're anxious to see where it goes, even when that happens, there's never that moment of like, oh, I wish I could skip this next chapter and get back to Constance or get back to Seymour or anything. I felt like every time I turned the page to a new chapter, which happens quite frequently in this book, I was on board for it. And that, I guess, my only critique about this novel, actually, but well, we might get into some more as we go. I don't know, but like my one big critique of this novel probably has nothing to do with the author itself, but how this book is laid out. Because this book is 600 and some pages, and I swear to God, 200 of them are blank pages or pages with like six letters on it, because it does the structural thing where each one of the chapters is has its own, see here, like here's chapter 15, it's it just says 15 and then says the name of the chapter on its own thing, and then you turn a page. It's just like I felt like I was turning pages so often with this thing. And that's like one of those things where I was like, was that the author's decision? Like, did he want to lay it out that way, where you have a page for the chapter, and then you have a page for the little section of Cloud Cuckoo Land, and then you have a page that says which location you're at and what year, and then you have a page like it's kind of wild actually. I mean, it's good because I kind of waited too long for this book, and if I had to actually read a fully 600-page book, it would have been kind of down to the wire. But because I only had to read about a 400-page book, I finished on Tuesday. And so it was just a weird thing, and that's one of those things that you wonder, is that the publisher or the author? I have no idea. Just a small little bit of quibbling.
Yeah, Door has broken the publishing mystery by giving us all the pleasure of reading a 600-page book, except it's only 400 pages. Um,
I mean, that's got to cost more money to publish, right? Like, uh, it's, it's not like it's not saving money.
I don't. I mean, I'm sure you're right. Um, yeah, just to briefly comment on the audiobook, which is mostly what I did. Although interestingly, I was on an airplane for like the middle third of the reading, and my my Audible wouldn't work on the airplane for some reason, and I happened to have a paper copy because my mom gave me her paper copy, um, and so I read one third of this book in audiobook, the other two thirds,
That's fun.
which was, yeah, it was interesting, right? And it really gave me an appreciation for the differences in the two mediums. But the audiobook is fun. There's one reader for kind of the main story, and then there's one reader for the folios, from Cloud Cuckoo Land, the
Oh,
book
that's
within the
fun.
book, and he like the guy who does the folios is like this very kind of animated, kind of playful voice that just makes it really fun. It's it's actually a fascinating contrast because the story itself, like this story gets very dark. Um, so it's definitely an interesting and impactful choice to have it sort of
Hmm.
threaded with this whimsical tale. I mean, that's kind of what it's about, right? So it's not like it's like jarring. It's like, no, this is like the point. The phrase, the phrase "slip the trap" keeps occurring throughout the book. It occurs at least three times, right? And like that's what it's all about. It's about like the the whimsy of of this story, which is about our eternal yearning for like the freedom from our suffering,
Hmm.
is giving people the power to momentarily slip the trap of their suffering and their existence. Um, and then ultimately they all end up wanting to return home regardless, of the fact that they suffered so much. It's just a really beautiful. I think that's one thing. Okay, like the prose is great, the characters are great, the
Yeah.
story is great, but like I think the reason most people love it, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's because the message is great. Actually, it's this
Yeah.
incredibly poignant, beautiful message.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think there's plenty of good books out there with good writing, but the thing that I think leaves you with it is the overall theme and the messaging, and I think a good novel, a well written novel with good prose and good characters, allows that message to really sink in and matter to you in ways that a less skilled author or less good book would. But I agree with you. I think this is such a beautiful book, and our chat is basically filled with people like with glowing reviews of this novel. Every
Yeah.
single person that read it, either those of them that had read it before, and or those that had read it for the first time just for this year book club, like everyone's positive on it, and that's so remarkable. I think I don't know. I do think there's something absolutely powerful about kind of how it sneaks up on you. Because one of the things I love about this book is actually the ways in which you start to realize what's going on and piecing the things together. You start to realize where you're looking at all these characters across the different stories, and you're like, oh, you're seeing how they're all ostracized, right? You're seeing how they're all different, either physically different, or the one character who's gay, the one character who has autism, and the cleft palate. It's like all these people that are kind of different from the norms of society and how society ostracizes them, and that's part of their suffering, and the kind of the unification of story, of meaning in story. Like, doesn't literally bring these people together, but across time and space brings a sense of understanding and comfort and belonging. That and I just love that idea, right? Like, that's why I love storytelling. That's why I love books. That's why I love reading. That's why I love talking about reading. Is these central ideas of just it's beautiful the way in which a story, and I think importantly a story that's not even complete, right? I think that's one of the things, and maybe we'll get into that a little more bit, but that the remnants of this folio they have are not complete. We don't know the whole thing. We don't have every word. We don't even truly have are of agreement on exactly the way it ends, but that still it can have this incredibly powerful effect on everyone that experiences it is just wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's great. I was skimming the chat while you were talking, and the you know people are throwing around words like love, which is you know you don't always see people say they loved a book, right? They say they
Mm-hmm.
really enjoyed it. People are saying they loved it. It was their favorite book of last year,
Mm-hmm.
or um yeah. John is saying something here that I want to pick out just because I was thinking this myself. John says the book is very good about being understated about itself. Doesn't try to come across as a great book, flips past your guard and gets you. And I totally agree because, um, I had heard that the prose in this book was great. And what's funny is as I was, listening at first, just audiobook listening, I wasn't thinking about the prose at all. Like I was just like if you had asked me like Matt, is the prose good? I would have been like, I don't know. I haven't been thinking about the prose. I've been so wrapped up in the story, which sort of is an indicator that the prose is like exactly what it needs to be,
Yeah.
because at no point are you like, and at no point are you like, oh my God, that was like those Cormac McCarthy sentences where you're like, wow, that was a sentence that you can sink your teeth into. It's like, no, I
Yeah.
wasn't noticing the sentences because they were just flowing, um, which is great actually.
Yeah, this is, I mean, this is kind of the eternal question, right? Is like, and I think about this a lot with movies as well. This idea of like, if a movie's working on me and I'm really into it, I tend to notice the directorial and the cinematographic flourishes less. And that doesn't mean like, sometimes I do notice them and I can just sit back and be like, oh, that camera movement was really great, or oh, that sentence was really great. And I wonder, like, Cormac McCarthy is such a perfect example of this, is that I was suffering through that book at times, but I was always, while doing so, being like, oh my God, these sentences are so amazing. And yeah, I never had that experience. Like, I never, this is a beautifully written book. Like, don't get me wrong, don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. I, I never once in my time reading this book was like, oh man, that's a really good paragraph right there. That's a really good sentence. I was just kind of steadily like intrigued and blown away, and along for the ride. And yeah, I mean, that's like, what is good writing, right? Is good writing that calls attention to itself, or is good writing that allows you to forget yourself in it? And I think there's value in both of them, right? Like, I think like we talked forever about Cormac McCarthy's ability to string some sentences together that say some deeply disturbing but also profound statement about the nature of humanity, right?
Mhm.
And this book does a similar thing, at least making statements about humanity, perhaps much more optimistic ones, but it does it in a way that doesn't necessarily draw attention to itself.
Yeah, and I actually think it's hard to write prose that just kind of totally stays out of your way.
Mm-hmm.
Like because I'm thinking about like these really amazing scenes that there's like spectacular and like harrowing and uh, uh, sort of like emotionally devastating, like where you've got like Omir is guiding his oxen, and like they're forging this giant cannon, and then they have to drag this giant cannon, and like what needs to happen there is the prose needs to just like dunk you in that, like immerse you in that, and stay out of the way, and it does that. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't know why exactly, but I think I was most attached to Omir, um, and that's an interesting like statement, I think, actually, like in terms of how this book hits
Mm-hmm.
you, because like each of these characters, I like love them and want to give them a hug. Um, which is definitely not always true of books.
Well, you didn't want to give anyone a hug
I,
from Cormac McCarthy's.
yeah, maybe the judge wants to give me a hug, but
Yeah,
no, I
yeah.
don't. Um, yeah, no, just like that was one level on which it works, right? You fall in love with the characters to like a way deeper degree than usual, actually. Like really, really, like really good at that.
The way Dor writes the experience with the oxen as they kind of slowly break down and die is some of the most emotional I've been reading in a long time.
Hmm.
And they're fictional animals. I was
Right.
seriously about to go fucking John Wick on anyone that fucked with these oxen. Um, it's awful. I mean, I think it's because the book does such a fantastic job of drawing Omir as a character, in his world where he's got these two, like he's outcast, obviously, like because of his cleft palate, and he's found these two animals that are like the closest thing he has to family, to brother and sister, right? And like they are kind of bonded immediately from the beginning, and the book does such a fantastic job of weaving all this through that, and then slowly over time showing them break down to the point where they finally die, and you're just so, like, honestly, I felt more devastated by that than anything in Blood Meridian. And I don't want to keep comparing this book to Blood Meridian. I think the only reason we're doing this is because it's fresh on our relative mind. I found that book incredibly disturbing and uncomfortable, but like this book made me sad in a way that that book never did. Um,
Yeah, I think one reason why we might be making this comparison is they're both kind of confronting like the struggle of human existence,
yeah, yeah,
and that book is like shoving your face in the latrine of it, and
hmm,
this book is more like, but you soldier on,
yeah,
and you suffer and you suffer, and you can find some scraps of meaning around the edges, and maybe that can be enough.
yeah,
Because I do like that. That's the one thing is nobody really gets their, no, nobody like wins, right?
hmm,
This is not a book where anybody just like succeeds and is happy ever after. It's really about the way that like that's just not what life is actually.
I think Anna gets the closest to that, but even so, like her life is filled with such, like her early life is filled with such misery that like she does, I guess, get as close to a happy ending as you possibly could.
Yeah,
Um, while at
sure.
the same time, like having this early life of like the grief and guilt she feels over what happened to Maria, like she carries with her entire life for sure.
Yeah.
But I think she gets the closest to it, and I guess you could argue Constance as well. Although I think the same thing with that, right? It's like,
Yeah, so this is great actually, because like you could totally contradict what I just said, but I think it's closer to a synthesis.
sure,
It's like kind of everybody gets their cloud cuckoo land, but it's not really what they expected, and then they end up going back home,
yeah,
metaphorically. I mean, literally in the case of Omir, Omir literally goes on a quest, which is full of wild things and suffering and tribulation, and then returns home.
yeah,
He's maybe the only one for which that's true, but you could say Constance, right? Constance.
Constance, yeah,
She desperately wants to go to Earth and wishes she wasn't on the spaceship. And then it turns out that hey, she gets her wish, but it isn't quite what she wanted. It isn't quite
mm,
what she thought it was. But it's something, right?
yeah.
It's better than dying alone on a spaceship. Yeah, John points out Zeno goes to war and comes back home. Of course, that's there's like Zeno's a unique character because there's young Zeno and there's old Zeno, and it's kind of the only story that does that specific thing with the flashbacks. I mean,
Yeah.
um, um, I guess his story is really mostly flashbacks, actually,
Yeah, I
and that
mean, that's one of the lovely structural things about this book, actually, in a way that sometimes it annoys me, but I didn't mind it in this book. Like we're introduced to Zeno kind of at the end of his life, right? Like
Mhm.
the story opens with the experience in 2020 in the library between Seymour and Zeno, and then we flash back and fill out both of their entire lives. I think the same with Constance, right? We start with Constance trapped in the vault already, and then we kind of see the events that led her there. And I thought that was really it is oftentimes that immediate res and then flashback format kind of frustrates me at times. It didn't here, and I think it's because the nugget we get of the characters is such an interesting one. Like I really liked the opening stuff in the library actually, and I don't even know why. Like I was still very confused about what this book was and what it was doing. And we have this character in a library, and then some other characters breaking into a library, and he's gonna blow it up for some reason. And I didn't know what was going on, but I was like really intrigued immediately for some reason. And I think that's why the kind of in media res format works on me. And as John says, I think yeah, the structure of the kids putting on the Cloud Cuckoo Land play like really really helped that too because it was pretty adorable.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I definitely that's part of the reason why I couldn't figure out like what are we doing here because it's like we just went from science fiction space opera to Die Hard um in the space of a couple pages.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you know, it's funny. I don't even remember actually starting with Constance in the Vault. I think I was so unclear on what that was that I just memory hold it. Although I did remember, I like forgot. I remember the scene where she sees the ant when she's a little girl or whatever, or a spider or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. And then I like forgot about that, and then I only remembered it after we start to suspect that something is off, and I was like, wait a minute, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and that's funny because I think the text starts suggesting to you that she's actually on Earth way before you actually realize it,
Oh
or no, like,
really?
uh, yeah. Well, I think it'd be interesting to see like when I figured it out. Like I figured it out. I'm not trying to like brag, but I because I feel like the text was trying to tell you. Um, but then I was like, no, that would be too much to hope for.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, that I don't feel I feel like that would be too clean of a resolution. And of course, it is true that she's on Earth, but it's really not a clean resolution because it seems like Earth is in really bad shape. Um,
Yeah.
so there's some precarity to it. But
Better shape than everyone on the ship though.
yeah, I like how a lot of stuff is never really explained. Like there's some kind of contagion. What is it? I don't know. Doesn't matter.
They're all dead.
They're all dead. That's all that matters. Did it come from
Yeah.
outside the ship? I don't know.
Probably.
Maybe. Probably.
Yeah.
Why didn't she die? I don't know.
Yeah. Because her dad loved her. And she had the because of the Cloud Cuckoo Land. That's why.
Because of the Cloud Cuckoo Land.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can I just say one of the things I really love about this book? Obviously there's lots of stories out there that take like that have the backdrop of some story within a story that kind of leads the story of the book through it. And I love that this book did that, and it had the little folio excerpts from the story, but then it also like the text itself actually wove those through the actual story. Like when we're at the part where uh, Athon is transformed into the donkey and is doing all that stuff. The text around the actual chapters around that is also making reference to that thing, and I just say I appreciate that as a person who, like, yeah, I think not to pick on Brandon Sanderson at all, but like the little excerpts he has at the beginning of his chapters are like super important, well, not super important understanding the plot, but like super important to if you want to like early guess the thing that's going on behind the thing. And
Hmm.
then like I would read those before I started the chapter, and then just like brain dump them as I got into the actual chapter with the characters. um and I think one thing I like how Cloud Cuckoo Land is so woven through it, and not just that we're having people reference it and then we're seeing copies of the folios themselves, but that like the actual story of the characters in the story within a story are woven through the story itself. I loved it. It allowed me, like, you finished this feeling like you actually also read Cloud Cuckoo Land in Cloud Cuckoo Land, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, it's this comedy about this dumbass,
He's
which
so stupid. I love him. I love him
it's
so much.
great. Yeah, right. Like he is one of the characters,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's
Mm-hmm.
one of the characters that we're rotating between, and I was actually interested in that story. Like,
Yeah.
despite the fact that it's like a comedy, and I knew that the ending was going to be, you know, a comedy ending, right? Not some horrible tragedy. I was like, I want to like what where are we going with this? Like so that like I love the almost like Borges level like games he's playing where it's like, well, we don't really know actually how the story ended. It could be that these folios are out of order and
Mm-hmm.
actually like so there's disagreement over does he get to his heavenly goal with the goddess in the book, and then it's a story of sort of transcendence, or does he get there and then realize that it isn't actually what he thought it was. It's not what he actually wanted, and then he ends up returning home and wishing that he'd never left home in the first place, and like these it puts that question in your mind by creating the Cloud Cuckoo Land inner story
Yeah.
the way that it does, and then it's almost like a choose your own adventure where you're like, well, which way do you prefer it?
Yeah, well, and
Because
that's you're absolutely right that this story can be a thing to all these people that is this thing that has survived throughout ages, and yet each person can still take their own personal meaning from it. I mean, that's just the author flexing about what the power of storytelling is, right? And I mean, like I was immediately what I love the way in which Zeno like is looking at the story a certain way. The kids start to read it, they immediately go like, no, 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 that doesn't make sense, this is how it should end. And like he's like, oh, I hadn't even thought about it from that perspective, like it hadn't even occurred to me that that makes the most sense actually. And it just goes to show like different perspectives, especially the idea of an old man at the end of his life versus kids at the beginning of their lives, and how they what they bring to the experience of reading a story. Just all good. And man, the thing that I love about this is like there's really nothing necessarily new in this thing, right? Like the message you just said, the idea of, you go on this journey searching for the perfect place, your utopia, your the thing that's going to make you the most happy, and you get there and you realize that, oh, really, this is not all it was cracked up to be. I was actually the thing that I wanted, it was waiting for me back home all along. Like that's not a new idea, right? That's kind of one of the oldest ideas we have, and that's I think one of the points, right? This is an ancient made up story, um, and it's it's capturing on one of the fundamental truths of humanity, is that we're always kind of looking for something better, especially in a world in which we're ostracized and made to suffer. We're always looking for our cloud cuckoo land, our place of utmost happiness, and it's not real. It doesn't exist. And part of going through this journey is coming to the realization that that's the case. And I don't know. It's not new. It's but that doesn't blunt its impact at all, I think.
no, no, it's just a really yeah, yeah. I mean, nothing's new is one thing you could say there. It's just
Sure.
a matter of how the execution is. I mean,
Yeah.
you were just pointing out the idea that it takes the children to notice that the story should end this way rather than that way. And really, you could say it takes the children's perspective for him to realize what this story even is.
Yeah.
And but it's not just that, because and I'm trying to tie this back to the idea of like it's all about the execution, because the kids, they're not just bringing meaning to Cloud Cuckoo Land for Zeno, they're bringing meaning to Zeno's life,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because he's had this horribly depressing life,
Yeah.
where just like he has never had a win. Zeno has never had a win in his entire life.
Yeah.
His is almost tragic comedy, in the degree of like him just being the butt of every turn is just like, and then it was almost good but it wasn't actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
because Rex was already with someone, or
Yeah.
he went to the war to try to prove himself, but he was immediately captured and made a POW, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. And finally, in his old age, these children are able to like make him feel alive for the first time. Um, and so it's like that's what I mean about like the cleverness of how this is put together. Yes, it is about finding meaning in the story, but it's also like just like finding meaning in your own life and and realizing that it might not look anything like what you thought it would.
Yeah.
Like
No.
it's not from a romantic love. It's not from being a war hero that Zeno finally finds meaning. It's hanging out with these kids
Yeah.
and doing a silly play.
Yeah, I love that because he was he picked up Cloud Cuckoo Land and began translating it before the kids even got involved, right? And you can kind of see a version of this in which he was translating this from the perspective of a person who, like the main character of that story, is wishing he could be in another place, in another life, living his dreams, right? Like Zeno's version of Cloud Cuckoo Land is he's with Rex, right? Maybe living in London still.
Mhm.
He gets this idea, and so as he's translating it before he really gets into the kids' lives, he's translating it from the perspective of someone who wants to get there and who wants that and who needs that in a lot of ways. And then they allow him to realize that this idea, the central idea of the whole thing, which is that that's not real, and even if it was real, it's inaccessible to you, and even if it was accessible to you, possibly it wouldn't be the thing you thought it was actually. And you have this thing here. Actually, it's not what you thought it was going to be, but it's something. And it is. I mean, I think it's profound and tragic that like he's finally at the end of his long life finally come to this realization, and then the plot goes, I'm sorry, now you have to blow up though. And like he does it being a hero, right? He like
Mhm.
saves these kids, and he saves the library, he saves stories, he saves storytelling. And like it's tragic and profound, and like I'm not like I'm sad for him, but like it's just like another. That's all I was thinking about as you're talking about like nothing ever goes his way, and it's like finally at the end of his life he's finally at this moment of contentness, and then here's a bomb, please sprint it down the road and and blow it up on you.
Yeah, so I don't want to like cast it as being rosier than I think it maybe was meant to be, but like it seemed like he wanted to be a hero. That was one of his things
Sure.
in his life.
Yeah, that's why he went to war.
That's why
um
he went to war, and he never got to be any of the things that he wanted to be. And then finally, at the end of his life, he finds meaning with the kids, and then he saves them all in this dramatic act of heroism. It's
yeah.
like it's tragic on the one hand, but it's like, hey, that's not a bad way to go out in your 80s
Sure. Sure.
to saving children from a terrorist. That's that's pretty badass actually. So
Yeah.
so like and so like to me that was actually, despite the fact that it was like extremely poignant, I was like, this is actually a win for him finally.
Sure. No, I get that. No, I get that.
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, part of me is always going to be sad when someone dies, but
sure.
I know exactly what you mean for sure.
Yeah.
And he saves the library too, which is
Yeah.
like the as Steve is pointing out in the chat is like this core central place for him that saved him when he was young, that continued to save him into his old age. That is this, which makes it all the more tragic when we learn that sorry, that building actually got knocked down. Which we haven't really touched on the I think Dor, obviously one of the things on his mind is climate change. Obviously this is a big book talking about climate change and the future of that, and the Seymour character like relatably distraught at the destruction of nature, right?
Mhm.
And there is a level of tragedy to this, and there is a like I found the passages in which you're seeing him kind of get suckered into extremist type stuff, and there's a real tragedy in seeing that slowly happen. But I think the book is not overly judgmental of him. I think the book is deeply empathetic to him, and sympathetic to him, And so even when you're seeing him go down these things, like there's moments where like he joins this environmental club, right? And like there is a level of absurdity to the idea of like, well, we got the lunch ladies to use like renewable forks and spoons in the cafeteria, and it's like that's great, and I don't want to minimize that. That's wonderful stuff, but like that's not going to actually do anything, right? Like that's not going to actually fix any of the problems that he's actually worried about. And so there is this really interesting thing where you're like, you get why he looks at that stuff and says, "This is ridiculous. This is not enough. We're on the brink of something truly, truly terrible," and is just perfect bait for this extremist nonsense that leads him to do something absolutely horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, I just sort of saw Seymour as a tragic character
Yeah.
completely, where I'm just like, yeah, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say I can imagine myself in that position, but maybe a bit like being a young man and feeling those sorts of feelings and then kind of being channeled in a certain direction
Mm-hmm.
by malignant forces seems pretty plausible. And you just feel bad for him, you know, and then once the library situation starts, you're like, this isn't what he wanted, obviously. This like he's just a dumb kid. He didn't think that any of this would happen. And then, you know, then you get to see him grow up and like he kind of turns into a great guy actually. Um, so yeah, I mean, I honestly, you know, this might be. Tell me if you disagree, because I'm just curious. But like, Seymour's story made me the saddest, despite despite Zeno's story being like objectively worse, and Omir's story having all these like tragic complications.
Yeah.
Seymour just like had just like a miserable existence in a way that nobody else quite did. Not that it's a
Yeah.
contest. I guess I'm just seeing if any of this
I,
rings
I
true to you.
I know what you mean. I mean, I think there's. I mean, did the book ever like use the word like on the spectrum or anything with him? It seems like he just kind of went undiagnosed
Yeah.
the his entire life. Like, I mean, he got on medication later, but I don't know if that was like we're going to help you with your autism medication or just we're going to dull the entire world so things aren't as tough to you anymore medication, which is not actually addressing the root of any of his issues. So I think there's a level of tragedy with that. And like I think Mary mentions his mother Bunny and the complex relationship those two have, and I think that's part of what made me very sad is like here's a woman who's like really struggling in her life too. Like she's like
Hmm.
really struggling. She is barely making ends meet, and she has this kid that she doesn't really understand. He doesn't really understand why he's different from anyone else and why he's struggling, and like he's putting her in situations that is hurting her ability to provide for them, and he doesn't know it and doesn't understand it. And that's something that you as a person on the outside reading it can see the absolute tragedy of that. And I think that's why it maybe affects us a little more than characters who are literally physically suffering in different ways.
Hmm. Yeah, he felt like sort of trapped and powerless in a way that,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, ironically, even Zeno like could fantasize about escape from the prison camp,
yeah,
but for Seymour, it's like this is a box there's no way out of.
yeah,
It's his life and then his perceptions also, like his distorted perceptions about like, yeah, you know, I need to become a terrorist. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think who have we not talked about enough yet? I feel like we maybe haven't talked about Constance very much, even though
yeah.
I was just as into her story as anybody else's.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was, you know, very interesting choice just overall to have this like science fiction thread throughout this story that really didn't need it, if you know what I mean. It's really unusual choice to put a science fiction story in a story like this, I would say.
Yeah, and I think I really enjoyed her story, and again, like because it's the one that takes place chronologically at the end of everything. It was the one that I think I was most confused about for the longest. I did not pick up on the "oh, we're on Earth" stuff until the book tells us to. By the way, so that's something that Yeah, it sounds like you and some of the other readers picked up on that a lot earlier than the book makes it extremely clear about it. But I did not. But I don't know. Once again, we have this. I think she's once again a character who is completely different from everyone around her. I like how it like I like the idea of the library as this great, uh, record of knowledge, and this idea in the world of Constance is that these are people that are always looking forward, right? That are constant, like, we're not going to look back. Everything we learn is only going to be about this future planet, which is all the more tragic when you realize that they're not actually going there. And she's different because she wants to just look and understand the past. And I do think that's kind of a critique on our tendency to always want to be pushing towards the next thing, the best thing, the better thing, and not realizing where we came from and the beauty of it, and also the mistakes that were made there. And I think that's one thing about the Atlas, that it's so great. And I kind of love the reveal of the Atlas of, like, oh, actually this beautiful serene version of the Earth they're looking at is total bullshit,
Hmm.
is just a hidden, sterilized version of the way things actually went, which is kind of how history tends to do things generally, right? Like when we write our history books, we tend to sterilize the worst possible parts of them, unless they happen to belong to the bad guys in our history stories, and then we bring those to the forefront. But so, like, this kind of journey that she goes on, falling in love with Earth as it was, and then realizing the true state of it, I found very, very fulfilling.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in her story that's kind of playing with the literalization of metaphor because if you think about it, they're literally flying to a literal paradise in spa
Yeah.
in space,
Yep.
or
Yep.
at least they think they are. Um, and I mean, I think that plays really interestingly if you think about her father as this boy who grew up on the book Cloud Cuckoo Land and wanted to go to Cloud Cuckoo Land,
Hmm.
and I think regretted it by the end of his life, regretted that choice.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and I guess one tragedy is that he never gets to learn that his daughter actually does get to return home, right?
Yeah.
Which is actually the way the book ends, or so Zeno thinks. Um, yeah, I like. That's the thing. It's not just a science fiction story. It's weaving in with all these other ideas.
Hmm.
Um, John correctly points out we haven't talked about Anna enough
Oh, yeah.
either, and yeah, it's so interesting, like how, like you said, all these characters do have a lot in common, but there's just like a different emotional tenor to all of them.
Yeah. The
That,
suffering they're going through, I think, is unique to each of them. Like,
yeah.
Anna is a woman living in a time where women really didn't have any freedom at all, and even in that world, she has less than most of the women around her. Also living in a world that I love. I love the moments of, like, everyone's just like, she's living in this world where everyone's just talking about the end of the world, right? Constantinople is about to be sacked, and everyone's just talking about, like, it really made me think of, what must it have been like to where, when a city is your entire world, and the city is about to be overrun, and that's just the literal end of the world for you, right?
Mhm.
I think that the book captured that emotion for me in a way that I've never really, like, thought about what that experience must have been like for people that lived through it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The kind of historical fiction angle
Yeah.
was great. I mean, that's another place where the prose is great because I don't know. We've read obviously a lot of stuff that could be classified as historical fiction, and I think this book just perfectly cued that line of giving you historical information that's interesting
Hmm.
without ever making you feel like you're receiving an info dump
Yeah.
or a history lesson. Because I definitely learned a lot about um, history from this book.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that until this exact moment, thinking, oh yeah, I guess I didn't know that about the history of Constantinople and so forth, but now I do. Um,
Yeah.
um,
uh, Bishop points out that Anna is paying a whole bunch of money for her sister to drink Quicksilver.
mhm.
It's like, why isn't she getting better?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's that. I mean, you pointing out that it's historical fiction. I mean, that kind of we look across the stories in this book, and this is kind of like Doer's White Album. Like he's
Mhm.
doing classical fiction, he's doing historical fiction, he's doing contemporary fiction, and he's doing science fiction, and he's doing all these things in the same book and weaving them together. And the point of that, I think, is that like it's story, right? It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what genre you're in. It doesn't matter what type of story you're telling. It is the power, the timeless, immutable power of story. One of the most emotionally affecting things for me was, speaking of Anna and her sister, is the idea that, when she read this Cloud Cuckoo Land story to her sister, was the only time in her sister's life that like it seemed like the pain went away, and it seemed like she was able to just leave herself behind for just a moment and embrace this other world. And that was, I mean, obviously tragic in that, like, I'm sorry she has to live that way, but like beautiful too. Like that is the power of storytelling, is that like you can for a brief moment kind of leave all your shit behind and enter this other world where people are suffering too, obviously, but it's different. And it's, I don't know, I just that was totally moved by it.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I I'm honestly, I don't know. I wish I understood how Door did some of the things that he does. This is one of those books where it's going to nag at me until I probably end up rereading it or something because um when I've said this before, I think, but like when I don't understand why something emotionally affected me, that makes me really curious and really respect that author as somebody. It's like, okay, this person is operating on a level of like psychology and narrative
Mm-hmm.
beyond what I'm capable of perceiving. They're just a level above me, and I can't, and I don't understand how they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, first of all, it's just, you're absolutely right. I think this is a very brilliant author. There's a reason he won won one of the most prestigious writing awards. But I do think, like, we don't have to overcomplicate it. Like, the reason this book works so well on you is because the characters are drawn so well and the prose is fantastic, right? And that really just has to be it, right? He's just like he's able to create characters that are very, very, very real feeling and impactful, and put them in situations that are immediately not directly relatable, but like empathy-esque relatable. Like, you've maybe never experienced things like these characters have experienced, but you've perhaps experienced the emotions they're going through. And it like, it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that, man. I mean, not that I'm saying it's easy to do. It's not easy to do. It's very difficult to do, but like why it works seems, I don't know, pretty simple to me.
Well, okay, that's fair. I guess it's just really surprising to me that he can do that as effectively as he can.
Yeah.
Because you'd be like, why am I so sad about the oxen? Why? It's like, well, it's not really a mystery. Like you just said, it's like, well, I care a lot about Omir, and the oxen are practically characters.
Well, yeah,
Like,
because from Omir's perspective, they're not,
yeah,
animals. They're not
yeah,
beasts of burden. They're
yeah,
people. Or they
yeah.
have emotions. They have wants. Like they exist. And so he constantly paints them with that paintbrush. And then, so as we see them go through their trials and tribulations, it's not just, oh, I feel bad for Omir because his animals are dying. It's, no, you feel bad for Tree, actually, because
Mhm.
Tree is suffering.
Yeah, exactly. Tree, tree and moonlight. Poor, poor oxen. I love them. Yeah. So I don't know. Genius book. I'm really glad that we read this.
I think, like, I want to go back to one thing you said at the very beginning, was that, like, when you listen to an interview with Dora about like the idea of spinning plates, and that's the thing. The spinning plates of the stories here and all the characters in the stories. I think this is one of those things that is like really complicated, what he did here. Like, it's really complex, from not even like a beat to beat, scene to scene prose perspective, but from just like a structural perspective as a story, like how he managed to keep you through it, and then realizing the right place to cut over to a different character, and like taking Cloud Cuckoo Land itself as a story and weaving it through, and knowing which part of the story would be most impactful to which character specifically, and when to do that, and when to like it just it's a thing that to me is incredibly complex that he set up for himself here. It seemed like he decided to sit down and write a book that was going to be very, very hard for him to do right. And he did it. And that is incredible, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of authors try to do this
Mm-hmm.
and often ends up like the ending of the Phantom Menace, where you're like, you went too
With
far in a few places.
Bent Westward asks, is the book saying the destruction of Constantinople was necessary for the story to survive? Because otherwise it would have rotted away in the old church. That's interesting. I don't know if it's necessarily saying, like, it's good that this city was sacked and all these people died, but just kind of showing the, like, unbeatable, like, life finds a way-ness of stories sometimes. And this is sadly not true of all stories, right? Because we have lost more stories over the course of history than I can count. But just that, like, the idea of that somehow it survives, right? Like, despite everything, it survives.
Yeah, it's about perseverance and like I don't think it was foreordained that the book be saved, right? Like
Yeah.
my feeling throughout the whole story was like this is not a story about a magic book that magically preserves itself
Yeah.
over time. This is a story about like just barely by the skin of your teeth you're able to preserve this one shred of something good in the midst of all this suffering, and the people who are in that suffering are like, this was really valuable to me. It didn't fill my stomach. It didn't solve any of my problems actually, but it made me feel better for 5 minutes, and that's actually really important. And I'm going to preserve this,
Yeah.
and and then and that's how it kept making its way forward over the centuries. And um, but like you said, a lot of stuff doesn't get preserved that way. There's no rule that says that it has to work that way.
I mean, it made me just think about the things that do, right? Um, like this, I think there's a reference to the Odyssey in this book. And early in my reading of this book, I think I messaged you and I was like, when are we going to read a fucking book club book that doesn't reference the Odyssey in some way? And the answer is never, because but that's so fascinating to me, right? Like,
Uh-huh.
this is a story that has over the course of thousands of years survived and been passed on. And is it the same way it existed back when it was first created? No, certainly not. Stories are changed, just obviously, like, I think this shows, even by the translation of Zeno, like, he changed the story a little bit. He added to the story. He took his own perspective on the things that they were saying, and that's part of the passing on of stories. But isn't it wonderful that these stories from so long ago continue to be talked about and shared?
Hmm.
Um, it's
Yeah.
it's just remarkable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about the Odyssey the other day, and I said something which, like, I don't know if there's any scholarly support for this assertion, or even maybe it's flatly contradicted somehow, but like my sort of layman's understanding of the Odyssey and the Iliad is that these were basically originated as oral um, poems that would be read aloud, or not read aloud, that would be
Hmm.
recited
Yeah.
aloud, and that the orators, would change the story a little bit based on the audience, or based on some creative idea they had when they were walking between cities or whatever. And
Hmm.
and so the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a lot of these oral tradition stories kind of evolved. And it evolved in the literal sense of natural selection, where like the version that did better last week, well, I'm gonna keep that part, and
Hmm.
that part that nobody thought was funny, that was supposed to be funny, I'm gonna drop that. Just like a comedy set where a
Yeah.
comedian will refine their bit week to week. And the fun thing about that is like, okay, so the audit so let's just pretend that I'm right, okay? The Odyssey evolved over time, and then other storytellers moving forward just kind of pick pieces of it that they like and they remix it.
Hmm.
And they're in a sense they're continuing the tradition of the Odyssey, you know. the Dark Tower is the Odyssey in
Yeah.
that sense,
Hmm.
um, or this book is,
Yeah.
which I think is really really cool and makes you feel tied to this web of humanity that goes back thousands of years.
Yeah. And I think that's, it's not a conversation about books or we don't talk about Tolkien. So that's his whole idea, right? That the whole idea of that, storytelling is this giant tree, and we're just, every new story is just a branch on this existing thing, right? And um, I don't know, I love it. It's I love this idea so much, and any book that like really picks up this idea and sees where it can go with it is just going to be like crack for me, because
Mhm.
I find this just delicious stuff to think about and talk about, and it makes me appreciate storytelling in a way that, we've been doing this for a while now. We've read a lot of books, we've talked for hours and hours and hours and hours about storytelling, and it's stuff like this that makes me go like, yeah, I'm glad I do this, and I am not tiring of it at all.
Mhm.
It's great. I love this book.
I agree. I agree. I have access to some really old books, and I'm like, got to protect these books, even if
Yeah.
who knows.
Well, it does, like, my son is still, too young for me to really like be passing on the stories that I love to him in any kind of real way yet. But like it makes me think about when those times come, and like the stories that are most important to me, and getting to share those and seeing his interpretation of them, the parts that work on him and the parts that don't, and all these cool things. And like that's one of the most joyous things about the passing on of stories and
Hmm.
storytelling, is what you said, like people remix it and pick out the parts they like or the parts that speak to them. It's why we've had so many conversations about how much I love adaptation, and what adaptation can be is kind of that same tradition, picking up someone else's story and talking about the parts of it that meant the most to you, or stuff like that. It's just it's wonderful, and I love it so much.
Hmm. I agree. That's it's one of the joys of having kids
Hmm.
is sharing with them the stories that you loved,
Yeah.
and yeah, or that you still love. Yeah.
John says the only way to avoid Odyssey references is to read the Iliad for book club, and then problem solved. Which is, I guess, technically true. I
I
hadn't
don't
thought
know.
about it that way,
I don't know.
but
There's this one character in it whose name I forget. I think it's Odysseus. Is
yeah,
that?
that's a total Odyssey reference. You're right. All right. Anything else you wanted to say about Cloud Cuckoo Land, Matt? I guess one of the things I will like, I think the thing that ties into all the things that you're talking about is the oral tradition of storytelling, is like Cloud Cuckoo Land. The folio that exists within this thing is within the frame of that. A telling of a story to a sick child, right? So like
Hmm.
this idea that like even from the beginning, even the first iteration of this story was this oral tradition of specifically trying to entertain someone who was suffering, and just like that is the kernel that begins the story, and that is the situation changes, the scenario changes, even the book itself changes, but that central kernel of it is that a story told to someone who is suffering to make them feel better remains true through thousands of years.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess as I agree with you. As we're wrapping up, Mary points out that um, disruptive technologies feature in this story. I mean, there's so like yeah, there's sort of unnecessary destruction of the environment by humankind, and a big part of that is um, these shifts in technology that we really do see repeatedly. We have um, the canon, which is I believe this is actually historically true that like the invention of the canon was effectively like around that exact point in time.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that you were going to be able to just knock down the walls of a city was kind of a new idea. Really changed the ability of Constantinople to defend itself, and the the AI at the end being transformative. Um, all of the climate change itself being caused by transformative technologies.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but there is a through line I think of basically the status quo being continually upset in ways that cause a lot of suffering by some new technology.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like that.
that's definitely true. Hmm. John says that the canon referenced in this story is real.
Hmm.
Even the amount of oxen it took to pull this thing. I don't know, man. I would have probably like constructed the thing a little bit closer to the city. That's just me though.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess it was just you either lug the resources or you lug the the finished product, right?
I mean, I was thinking about how funny this is because like then like hundreds of years later, the Nazis built this gigantic, like absurdly gigantic cannon that had to be transported on like rails, and it's like really purely a vanity project. Like
Mm-hmm.
you'd always be better off just building a bunch of smaller weapons that can be maneuvered and transported more easily, and you can concentrate their fire on one spot and probably have the
Yeah.
same effect. Um,
Did, and correct me if I'm wrong. It didn't seem like obviously they rolled up to Constantinople with this cannon and figured like one day of this thing pounded into the walls, we're in, it's done. That's not what happened. Did did it did it do anything in the actual siege? I don't think it. I don't think the reason Constantinople fell was because of this big cannon.
I literally don't know. I think
John
this
is
is
saying no right now as we talk about this.
you're probably right. This is one of those funny things about the book is how it like cuts away from certain things that you like you thought you think this is going to be a book about the invasion of Constantinople, and then we just kind of cut away, and then like later we see like there's some people who were part of the siege. So
Yeah.
I guess it was successful, but you're
Well,
never really sure.
it's because none of our like point of view characters like have any involvement in the siege
Sure,
directly, right? They're just backgrounded characters, like either
right?
because of the way the book is talking about those kind of downtrodden and ostracized characters.
Yes. Yes, my point is more that like maybe you think you're building towards some epic thing, and
No,
and then
yeah,
and then the camera repeatedly, metaphorical camera repeatedly cheats you of that, which
yeah,
I say cheats, but it's like no, that's not the story. That's definitely not the story. And
yeah.
there's a
It's
lot
like
of go ahead.
Cloverfield.
Yeah, yeah,
I can't believe I
yeah.
just interrupted you to say it's like Cloverfield.
Like Cloverfield, yeah. I was gonna say something really interesting, but now I forgot it because you said it's like Cloverfield.
It's like when the
Um,
camera almost has the monster in the display, and
and you're
then
like, get out of the way. No, no. What I was gonna say actually is another, like I can think of other examples of things where the story never actually says something. Like they get back to Omir's home and it's all told from Anna's point of view,
hmm
and there's just a conspicuous absence of an old man.
yeah, you don't actually know that Grandpa's dead until yeah,
I don't even remember if the text ever says Grandpa was dead. Like it's just clear for you, like you get it immediately, but the text doesn't show you. You know what I
and
mean?
that's a really good point in general because like the choice structurally to tell the return home
Mhm.
from the perspective of the outsider was an interesting one, right? Because there's part of you that wants to see what it's like emotionally for Omir to get home, right? This is he's wanted to get home the whole time and he's finally there. And of course the tragedy of it is that like what he thought was home is not really anymore because his grandfather's already gone. And he has to kind of build a new home for himself without his grandfather. And yeah, the text chooses to withhold that from you in order to put you in Anna's frame of mind with what it's like to you know leave your home to join a place that you're safe but everything is new. You don't speak the language. You're kind of terrified constantly and her. I mean, I'm I'm glad. Like actually, like I'm glad we got to see this from her perspective and not his. Actually.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was an interesting and good choice to do it
Mm-hmm.
that way.
Yeah. Hey, good book. Good book.
Yeah,
This Anthony guy seems to know what he's doing.
he does. Yeah.
Are you gonna check out more of his books after this?
I wouldn't say it's like at the top of my priority list,
Sure.
but now that I am like aware of him as a writer, he's probably on my list of like people to keep an eye out for.
Yeah. I do want to read All the Light We Cannot See, which I believe I own because my wife has read it.
Mhm.
So that should be easy for me to do because I really did enjoy this.
Well, that's good. Let me
Hmm.
know if you do that.
I will. I will. All right, we are going to lock the voting for um, next month. So if you have not voted in that poll yet, now is the time to do it. I'm going to refresh it just a couple more times. Okay, it's done. It's done, Matt.
Okay, good.
It has been decided. Next month, it looks like we are going to be heading back to one of our favorite authors on the book club. We are doing another Ursula K. Le Guin novel because we are going to be reading The Tombs of Atuan, which is the sequel to The Wizard of Earthsea, a book we read, gosh, 5 years ago? Four, somewhere around there.
Feels about right.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love Le Guin. Like you said, um, enjoyed all of her books,
Yeah.
without exception, quite a lot. A lot of them have stuck with me exceptionally strongly, so I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think The Dispossessed and the other one I'm blanking on right now are two of my favorite books that we've ever read. So,
Mhm.
um,
The
what
Left
was
Hand of
what,
Darkness.
The Left Hand of Darkness? Thank you. Two wonderful books. I also really liked the first Earthsea novel, and I've always kind of wanted to go back and read the rest of Earthsea, and I just never did. Um, but now we get the opportunity to read the second. I might actually read the first again in preparation for that. My understanding is like they obviously exist in the same universe and are similar, but not. It's not necessarily like a you must remember all of this detail of the first book to read the second book type of novel. But
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I know that there are multiple books set in the Earthsea setting.
mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know either. I'm excited though. I'm excited to my impression of A Wizard of Earthsea was that it was like more written for a younger audience, and
Yes,
we still enjoyed it. We still had a good time talking about it. But I definitely enjoyed her other novels more just because they felt like they were at a higher level.
yeah,
But I do just find myself wondering where this one is going to fall, and even if it is written for younger audiences, I'm sure we'll still have a great time with it. But
yeah. I think so. I think so. We've already done Project Hail Mary. We did a whole book club on that book.
we did.
Yeah,
It was great.
it was
Great book.
wonderful. Yeah. So we're not going to add it to the list because that would be repetitive.
But good news.
Yeah. Good news for you is there's an episode out there right here on YouTube.
Yeah.
You can listen to us talk about it. Okay, good. John says you don't need to read the first one to read The Tombs of Atuan. So I probably will not reread it then. I have like a beautiful my sister bought me like this beautiful thick as hell illustrated version of all of the Earthsea novels that's just been sitting on my shelf going unread for a couple of years now. And so I'm excited to kind of crack that open to read this one.
Cool. It'll
But
be fun.
yeah, yeah. That episode is going to happen on, I believe it is going to be the 5th of May because we are still kind of a week off from our inadvertent delay a couple months ago. So we want to give people 4 weeks to read the books. And so 4 weeks from today puts us on May 5th. Eventually, we will get back to the last Friday of the month, Matt, but it will not be this month.
That's okay. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll strategically have a short book at some point.
I actually think this is a relatively short book, but I've already said it. So May 5th.
It's done. Okay.
Yeah. So 5th of May, 9:30 p.m. Right here, we'll be reading or discussing The Tombs of Atuan, the second novel in the Earthsea cycle. I'm looking forward to revisiting this world. I think you're right. I did definitely got the feeling, oh, this is definitely a book meant for a younger audience, but I still really enjoyed my time with it, and I
Yeah.
hope that continues.
And it was extremely well written, of course.
Of course, because it's Ursula.
Right.
She's wonderful.
Yes.
I need to read every single thing she's ever written. That's my goal in life ever since we read The Left-Handed Darkness. So we will continue on with that here next month. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. This was a great conversation about a book that I think we both really, really loved. And it seems like everyone who read it really loved it. I don't think I saw a negative thing in chat besides the fact that this is a book about climate change that killed so many trees. So many trees.
They were probably sustainable trees, though.
You're right. You're definitely right. That has to be it.
Yeah, or compostable. The
Uh,
books are compostable.
that's true. That is, I mean, by definition. Thank you so much for everyone tuning in live. If you are listening to the podcast after the fact, we hope that you will join us next month for The Tombs of Atuan, the second book in the Wizardiverse. It's just so much more fun when there's a lot of people talking here. So thank you everyone who showed up, and please consider coming live next time.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It was a great conversation, and a lot of it was us kind of riffing on stuff people were saying in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
Chat was one of those times when the chat was kind of going fast enough that I couldn't necessarily like react dynamically in the moment. But from my perspective, that just makes everything better for me. It makes it easier for me because I can
Yeah.
steal your ideas and pass them off as my own.
I mean,
Um,
that's really what we've been doing for 5-6 years now, so
yep.
it's worked so far.
Yeah. So thank you all for volunteering for that. Um, anyways, if you like what we do here at Doof Media and you want to see more of it, then head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia and consider donating to support our organization. At any available level, you'll get access to vote for the books we talk about each month here on the book club, as well as a bunch of other exclusive cool features. So go check it out.
That's right. And if you haven't checked out this week's Doofcast episode, it dropped this morning. I got to sit down with our friend Elliot and talk about The Last of Us for 2 whole hours. We talked about the television show, we talked about the video game. It was a great conversation that Matt could not participate in because he's refused to play or watch or do anything with The Last of Us. And so we had to ban him from the episode. But it was a great conversation. Check it out. It's available everywhere now.
Just not God of War.
No time for anything that's not God of War. If you have any questions or comments or just want to reach out to us, you can find us over on Twitter at doofmedia. You can email us, doofmedia@gmail.com, or you can go to the subreddit r/doofmedia and just set a post there, and we'll probably respond within a reasonable amount of time.
Maybe.
It depends on the day of the week it is.
Right.
All right, that's going to do it for us this month. Thank you all again. This was so much fun. I love this book. If you, for some reason, have listened to this entire episode and have not read this book yet, oh boy, go do it. It's worth it. I promise. Go to Barnes & Noble. This version that I have right here costs $1 billion. I did not realize that. I went there and they had the normal paperback version and they had this Barnes & Noble exclusive version. And I was like, this looks nice. I like it.
Uh-huh.
And so I just grabbed it and went up to the front and the lady was like $50. And I was like, what? But I was already committed.
Yeah, can't back out now. You have to go through that line.
But I rolled the dice, and I'm glad I did, because now this is a book that I'm going to want to keep on my shelf forever, because that's what I do with the books that I love. And so I'm glad I paid a little bit extra money for it. So that's Cloud Cuckoo Land. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month. $50.
They may have gone too far in a few places.